Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tim Gleisner, Head of Collections at the Library of Michigan, here today with Sharon Harrigan, author of Half, one of our many Michigan Notable Book Award winners for 2021. Again, if you want to watch our videos, come to our webpage at the Library of Michigan, and all of our notable book videos are on our YouTube channel, and those are all available through our website. Sharon, how are you today?
I'm great, Tim. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, thank you. And you're calling from where again?
I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is about 2 hours south of DC. It's where the University of Virginia is.
Sure, sure. And for those who don't know, that's also the home of the Rare Book School. Very noted in librarian and archival circles. Just a bit of arcane information there. So Sharon, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your background? How long you've been writing? And how did you get to become a writer?
Okay, great. Yeah, I recently was asked to come to a book group. People have book groups and sometimes they invite the authors to talk. And once one participant said, "Why did you decide to write about Michigan?" And I said, everything I write is about Michigan because I grew up in Michigan. To me, it seemed like a very obvious answer. And I think a lot of people, no matter where you live, and I lived in New York City, and I've lived in Paris, and now I'm in Virginia, but I think a lot of writers would say the same thing. It's where you grew up. That's where your heart is. And that's the most vivid experience that you have. And for me, there's also just so much material to mine. In Michigan, the landscape, both in downstate, where I grew up in the Detroit area, and up north, where my grandparents would take us in the summers in Kalkaska County. So I am a Michigander, in heart and spirit, even if not physically right now. Right. So that's my background. And I always wanted to be a writer. I started writing when I was 14. I started taking poetry classes at the Detroit Institute of Arts, the DIA. It was my brother. And then I went to New York and went to Columbia and took poetry classes with Kenneth Koch. And it was only later in my life, after I, got married and had a job and a child, when I realized I was reading more fiction than poetry, and I decided to go back to school and get an MFA in fiction. So that's what I did. I was I think of myself as both an early bloomer, because I started really writing very seriously when I was 14 and even getting poems published in national literary journals. But then it was only in my 40s when I got my MFA in fiction. So pretty recently. So I'm a late bloomer too. So I hope that gives people hope. It really, is never too late to become a writer, unlike, say, my husband's an economist. I think it's like math related jobs. People or music, they tend to peak really young. But right. But writers, I have a student. I teach writing at a local literary center here. I have a student who's 82, wow. And her work is amazing. She's working on her first book. She's also a physician, so she had, a separate life before she became a writer. So yes, take my example. It's never too late. And I teach, as I said, after I got my MFA, I decided to teach at a center called Writer House here, which is has writing classes for adults. And it's been amazing to me to have, physicians and, climatologists and psychologists and lawyers and people with so much rich professional and life experience to come to sit around a table with me and learn how to write fiction. And I also teach memoir. So yeah, I taught a class this morning from 9:30 to 12:30. We're still doing Zoom, but we're going to go back to in person in the fall.
Fantastic. I know I'm zoomed out. So Let me ask you a question. Well, I have a bunch of questions from what you just said. So first, you were writing poetry until your 40s. Is that correct? Had you dabbled in fiction before your MFA?
No, I had never written fiction, though I was an avid reader of fiction, always. Yeah.
Okay. And so, I got to ask, what's the difference of writing fiction in comparison to poetry?
Yeah, a lot.
Give me examples, because I'm fascinated.
Well,
I
yeah,
dabble in writing.
but the
Yeah.
other thing is that I have to tell you is that I got my MFA in fiction, but my first book was not a novel. My first book was a memoir. So I have the visual right here, playing with dynamite.
Nice.
Yeah, so I've had a really circuitous path,
Okay.
and I can talk about that later. But the difference between writing prose and writing poetry is really more than I thought it was. I thought I know how to put words together and beautiful images and metaphor, and I know how to get beautiful rhythms. But in prose, you also need to have an engine. You need to take the reader from the beginning of the story through the middle and to the end, and you need to keep them turning the pages because they want to find out what happens next.
Sure.
Certainly there are poems like that, I think, that have plots, but but in fiction and in memoir too, it's really necessary to keep the reader engaged and wondering, keep them in some kind of suspense, some kind of desire to turn the page.
Very nice. So let me ask you, why do you write? I mean, why have you felt the need to write from such a young age up until now?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I really can't remember a time when I didn't feel that need or that desire. I think it's about like knowing that we go around every day sharing a part of ourselves that's the exterior part, and that can sometimes be superficial, and sometimes we even feel the need to hide a lot of what's going through our brains all the time.
Sure.
And then when I read books, I had this sense of, okay, in books, you can see what's going on below the surface. These are the things people don't tell you. These are the things that a casual observer would not notice. And so that I just found fascinating. And then, of course, connecting through books and seeing, yes, other people think these same crazy thoughts just like I do, and feeling less alone, and wanting to then do that for readers. What writers did for me.
How hard is it though to get those crazy thoughts on the page? I mean, because you're right, we all have thoughts. I mean, how hard is it sometimes to get that from your mind onto the page?
Yeah, well, that's why I did my MFA, because it is very hard. And it's and when people ask, why would you go to an MFA? Like, I know how to write, I know how to spell, I know how to make a sentence. Well, there is a lot of craft involved. And sometimes I give people the analogy of like, it's like playing a musical instrument, right? You have to learn not just the notes, but there's so much about the artistry involved, how to get your instrument to do all the subtle things, or it's about painting. You have to learn the technique of how to translate, as you said, this thing that you have in your brain, so that other people can see it and experience it, what you're trying to get out of your head. So yes, it is hard, and there are a lot of techniques, and I now really enjoy talking about those techniques with my students, because they're kind of like shortcuts. I mean, you could probably figure these things out yourself through trial and error, but then but if you know the shortcuts, it just makes it your progress is faster, and that's fun to see.
So if I may ask, I find it interesting that you started with memoir when you got your MFA. Why memoir?
Yeah, I call myself an accidental memoirist. I never meant to do it, but what happened was, I was getting my MFA, and one of my fellow students said, when you graduate, you need to start a blog, because that's what writers do. They don't do that so much anymore. But so I started a blog, and I said to my friend Hope, well, what am I going to write about? And she said, well, write about your life. So I wrote some blog posts, and one of them was about when my daughter turned 8. And I said, my father never got to see me turn 8. My father died when I was 7 in a mysterious, bizarre accident that I never understood. And I posted that blog post, and then my brother responded to it and added all his memories. And I took that and I turned it into an essay, and that essay got published. And then after that, my mother and all these people started responding. And it was just like this little snowball that grew into a snowman. And it really did take on its own momentum and kind of a life of its own. And so at that point, I realized I had to learn how to write a memoir. So So I spent a lot of time reading memoirs, and there's some, structure in common. I think a lot of memoirs do read like novels because there's, there's a compelling story and there's some suspense involved. In my case, it really was kind of like a detective story in that there are all these questions like, I actually don't know how my father died, and I don't know how he blew off his hand with dynamite. The title is Playing with Dynamite. Before I was born, and so I had to trace down the sources, and before people who had this information were no longer alive. So
Right.
that was a ticking clock too. And that's why I felt like I'm going to put my fiction aside for now, and I'm going to focus on this memoir while I can, while the people I need to talk to are alive, while the sources there are still available. So I did that kind of quickly, in this kind of intense, search. And then that came out in 2017. And then I was very happy to go back to fiction, where you can make up worlds, and it's these you can have these imaginary characters who are not going to get mad at you if you say things about them that they don't like.
Well, I'm intrigued by that because I get a lot of history writers when I do these talks, and I always ask about their research and everything else like that. And you alluded to the research where you had to get the subjects before they passed, but that's always intrigued me about fiction because I get some authors who, they know nothing about their subject and they will go spend, especially with historical fiction. I can think of one book last year where, she had never even been to the locale before and spent weeks up there and stuff like that. You say you make things up, but is there an element of research that you have to do in your fiction?
I mean, certainly there are some autobiographical elements in my novel, and not just the fact that my characters grew up in Michigan, where I grew up.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the novel is about twins, and I'm not a twin. That's usually
Right.
the first question people ask me: are you a twin? And if not, then how do you know so much about them?
Yeah.
So that was fascinating. There is a ton of research about twins because psychologists and people in the medical field, love to write about them because you control for a variable, which is that they share the same DNA. So
Sure.
you can test out things in the environment. So that was fascinating to read about twins. I read some memoirs by identical twins, and some of the kind of almost magical seeming things that I thought were old wives' tales are actually true. The twins separated from birth who end up having all these similarities that seem uncanny. But the part that is based on my life and is that I wasn't a twin, but I based the two sisters' relationship on my relationship with my brother.
Okay.
And in the first incarnation of my novel, the two characters were a boy and a girl, a year and a half apart, which is the case with my brother and me. And we were very close. I think partly because our father died when we were very young. We didn't really understand how to cope with that. And people would ask us to talk about our feelings, which we didn't know how to do. So we kind of made up this baby talk language between ourselves that allowed us to express how we felt without using real words.
Sure.
And so that's kind of where the book started. It opens with this scene of these small children kind of pretending they're babies and understanding each other without having a kind of secret code. So that was intriguing to me. And that's something I understood. Like I understood the feeling of that intimacy, being close to someone and having that feel like that relationship is kind of protecting you, that, at least you have one person who understands you. Sometimes that feels like it's enough.
So why the vehicle of twins? What made you go from, a year and a half apart as siblings to twins? Was it too autobiographical for yourself?
It was really a technical reason, which is I decided to write it in the we voice. So it's two people who are speaking in one voice. We did this, we did that.
Right.
It's also sometimes called the first person plural. And it just got, like, I couldn't actually have a girl and a boy saying some things because, like, it made no sense. Like I had the girl putting on lip gloss. We didn't put on lip gloss if it's a boy and a girl.
Right.
And so, and even when they're little, their play is such that it got in the way. you know, and then also having them different ages also made it more complicated. They couldn't be in the same grade at school. They couldn't be at the same place at the same time experiencing the same things. And they couldn't convince the reader, which is a real leap of faith, kind of a magical thing I'm asking the reader to believe, which is that two people could actually speak in one voice, or that the world could perceive them that way, could look at them and think of them as being interchangeable.
So I got to follow up on this, and I apologize if I belabor it, but how long have you worked on the book or the story with the idea that they'd be a year and a half? And, were twins always in the back of your mind when you were doing this? And then one day you just decide, you know what, this isn't working. I think twins would be a better vehicle to propel the story.
Well, so the novel grew out of a short story. And the short story, the first draft, was a girl and a boy, different ages. But by the time I got to the final draft of the story and it was published, they were twins.
Okay.
So
in your research, did you ever interview any twins, or were you just reading studies?
I did. I did. I people I know who are twins, I interviewed them and I gathered information. And one of my happiest moments was when one of the people who I'd interviewed was a twin, read the book, and she wrote about it. She wrote a review actually about how it was, and she picked out the things that often fiction writers get wrong when they're writing about twins, because there's actually been a number of twin stories recently, and then she pointed out the places where she felt like I got it right. So that was one of the best things, actually, to feel like someone who's in a group, I'm not part of that group, but then have her say that I got that right.
Can I ask, what were the things that she thought you got right? Can you name one or two of them?
Oh, I don't really remember. I think one of them was what I alluded to just a minute ago, which is this idea that when you're a twin, sometimes the world looks at you as if you're not an individual, and they mistake you for your twin. And that kind of effacement, or that kind of erasure, how that actually can be painful.
Okay. All right. So you have this book, and I always ask this of everyone, what's your practice with writing? Do you have 4 hours a day? Do you have an hour a day?
8 hours a day. No, I'm kidding. I wake up at 4 a.m. No, I do. I do know people who wake up at 5 a.m. and write every single day. They're 1,000 words, and I am in awe of them, and I admire their perseverance. But I would say that I sometimes, recently, I've gone in stretches of writing my 1,000 words a day. I have a new novel I'm working on. But then I have times when I'm traveling, or when I'm teaching, or when I'm working on freelance work, where I put it aside for a few weeks at a time, but I know I'll always get back to it. So I guess I would also say to other people who are writers, don't feel bad when people tell you your writing practice, your schedule has to be a certain way, or else you're somehow, you're not a real writer, or you're not trying hard enough. I really think that everybody figures out their own individual schedule and whatever works for them. And so don't be too hard on yourself.
So your memoir, so did this, I talked to somebody else earlier today where they basically said, the story kind of just got them. They weren't looking for the story. Is that the case with Half?
Yeah. So Half, the part that I mentioned of the two young children doing this, having this kind of special secret code way of talking to each other, and that is the autobiographical part, and that was the seed. That's what grew into the novel. And when I was, and it starts when they're 5 years old, and I vividly remember being 5 years old and telling my future self, I am not going to forget what this feels like. And grown-ups don't get it. And what it feels like, or what I remember, is a sense of helplessness and not being in control of your life. And I think that's true of all children. And that as adults, we probably, I have the sense I know that's all these people, all these grown-ups in my life have been 5 years old, but they don't remember, and I'm going to remember. And so, and also my favorite number was 5. And I said, it's always going to be my entire life. So I had this sense of like the child that gets lost, you know, like that we leave behind. I wanted to carry that with me. And so that felt kind of like a mission. Like, could I do it? Can I make this, you know, because they're not, 5-year-olds are not writing their own books about their experiences. And then of course, you know, I have my own children. And so I have, and my daughter is a writer herself now. And so she's been, she helped me get the ages, the authenticity of each age, I think, on the page. And, you know, in my book, they start at 5 and then they end at 18. And then there's a section where they're at the end where they're adults and have their own 5-year-old children. And so at each stage, I would say to my daughter, like, could you read this when they're 11? And does this feel like what it felt like to be 11? Or she would tell me, well, this part seems right, but this part is not. And so I really did feel like it's a mission to capture girlhood on the page, at least I mean, I hope it's universal, you know, nothing can be completely universal, but I hoped that it was, that many people could see themselves, or either, you know, remember what it was like to be a girl, or imagine what it's like to be a girl. And so, yeah, that definitely felt like I was called to do that. And also to remember what it was like to be a teenage girl too, which there are a lot of ways in which there's also the sense of not having control, and of being, you know, like being these bodies that are always being seen and so visible, and what people, how people perceive the, you know, the
So is that the
teenage
main
girls in the
theme,
world.
like just of the book, of just trying to convey a childhood and what it meant to be a girl and then a teenage girl? I mean, is that
Well, so that's one of the themes. I mean, and I was inspired by Richard Linklater's movie in 2014, Boyhood, in which he takes a boy from the age of 6 to 18. But also, you know, as I said, a book needs an engine. So that's, you know, that's kind of like a theme. But there's like, what is the thing that, what are things that happen? What's the plot that will keep the readers turning the pages to find out what's going to happen next? And yeah, so for that, I set up this kind of this mystery at the beginning. It opens with the girls who are grown-ups now, who come back to Michigan. They've moved away for their father's funeral, and there's a question about what happened. Someone killed their father, and who did it? And are the girls culpable? And is it their fault? And this propels them to revisit pivotal moments in their childhood to find out how culpable they are, and who did this, and did he deserve it? So I do set up this engine of this murder mystery, and I also set up this mystery of, are the girls going to be able to continue to speak in one voice, in a we voice, or is something going to happen to break them in two? And the stakes are high if they do break in two, because they've been so bonded together. What will happen to them then? How will they survive? So, and I guess what it's about is also how close can you be to someone? What are the risks that you take when you're so close to someone? Because then, you know, if you lose that person, what happens to you if you're so fused together? And so it's about close relationships in general, and this twin relationship is kind of an exaggerated version of a close relationship, so we can all see our own close relationships in that. And it's also about empathy. You know, the idea is, with these girls, what happens to you happens to me. Like they both experience the same thing, but I think in all of our lives, we have some sense of that too. Someone we care about, if something bad happens to them, we feel their pain. I mean, I think even literally, like in our bodies, we feel that it can make us hurt. And so I think sometimes taking these ideas and putting them in an extreme version helps us to see what they mean to us in a, it's easier to see our own lives.
I'm fascinated when you say extreme version. I mean, so you're basically taking your life and you're putting in a extreme version. I mean, how did that work? How did that feel? I mean, is there an example that you could give that, came from your life that you put into that extreme version in half?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this an example. I'm very close to my brother, right?
Mhm.
And so a funny thing happened when the book wasn't out yet. It was a few months before the book came out. He came to visit me in Virginia for Christmas, and we were going for a walk, and he told me about something bad that happened to him. And I felt the pain like transfer into my throat. All of a sudden, like I felt my throat hurt. And I immediately, or not immediately, but soon after, got a sore throat. And actually for several months, my left vocal cord was paralyzed. And so to me, that felt like, and this happens with my kids too. They tell me about something with my husband, my friends, something bad happened to them or good happened to them, and I feel like it happened to me. And so I wanted to kind of to take this idea and show it, like not only in this book does it feel like something happens to you, it happens to me, but it actually does. Everything that happens to one of them happens to both of them.
So describe that relationship for our viewers. Describe that relationship between the sisters in half. How would you describe that?
Yeah, maybe I should have done that at the beginning.
No, it's all right. No, and again, this is just a free-flowing conversation.
Yeah.
And then it comes up, it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, so their relationship is, from the very beginning, they say, they talk, we, what is the first line? We wanted to crawl back in time. We were only 5, but that wasn't young enough. We wanted to be babies again. And then they say we were identical twins, so we spoke in the same voice. Everyone responded to us, at least, as if we did. So, and that last line is important too. Everyone responded to us, at least, as if we did. So there's a sense of, is it really magical that they had the same thoughts, did the same things? Or was it really just that the world didn't distinguish them and acted like you're half of a whole?
Right.
And I think, from the experience, that what I told you about the woman who's a twin, her experience was, yes, people do act like I'm not an individual. Like my sister and I were like we're the same, and she felt kind of erased by that.
Wow.
So what happens, I mean, it's a spoiler, is in the end, they do actually separate and speak in separate voices. And it's both, you can read it as being tragic, as being sad, because they spend a lot of the book worried about what will happen if they get separated and doing every single thing they can possibly do to keep together. But then when they separate, another way to look at it though is that and my daughter has said to her experience was it's a relief. It's like finally they get to be their own people. And so she said that it made her feel like, like in high school, there's so much pressure to conform and to like be a member of a group and to not ever stand out as an individual. And that's what it kind of felt like, she said, reading about these girls who were speaking the same voice, like they were conforming, in a way that the world expected them to be, and to not stand out, to not differentiate themselves. And then when they finally could, it was just like this freedom, this liberty, this liberation. Yeah, so I'm playing with these ideas too. And I think, I think probably everyone as a teenager has that experience of feeling peer pressure to conform.
Sure.
But I guess I feel more of an authority to talk about the experience for girls, which is what I'm going for there.
Of course. So now, as you're playing with those ideas, and you mentioned your daughter a couple of times, reading this, I mean, would you send pieces to her? Did this come over as a whole work? And how did you make the changes when you were conversing with your daughter?
Yeah, well, sometimes I would just run an idea by her, like, is this what somebody would wear? Is this what somebody would say? Is this what music they would listen to? And then sometimes, so I would write, each age is its own chapter. So age 5 is a chapter, age 6, etc. Sometimes I'd say, here's the chapter when they're 13. Could you read this and tell me if this seems like how it feels to be 13? That was like one of the most fun things about this project. Yeah, I asked her just before we got in this interview how she felt about my co-opting her life, and she said, well, she's a writer herself. She said, well, I do that all the time to other people. This is what we do.
Describe that. What do you mean co-opting someone else's life?
Well, just like taking, like maybe I would look in her closet and see her wardrobe, and then I would give my wardrobe to my characters.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I would take some of the music she's listening to and have my characters listen to it.
So I got a question too. This is Michigan Notable Book, so I have to ask, Michigan. I mean, you are a Michigander. What did you have to do, and quite frankly, to bring Michigan into the story? But then, second of all, could the story work anywhere else, or could it have worked anywhere else?
I mean, not for me. It's so the father, he works in the auto industry at the beginning. He loses his job, so that's something that I remember experiencing as a kid. The dominance of the auto industry in the Detroit area, and then how that changed people's lives when that was no longer, there's no longer this guarantee of a middle class life and wage and all the things that people had come to expect. So I wanted to put that economic reality in my book in a way that I felt was distinctly something that someone from Michigan would identify with. And then there's also Upper Michigan up north, which is an important part of my book, and I think up north is an important part of people's lives. My daughter, she spent her last year, senior year of high school at Interlochen, which is near Traverse City, and so we recently just drove up there to pick her up, yeah. So, and we saw, I think it was like near Memorial Day, all these cars coming from downstate with their boats and their trailers and their recreational vehicles. And I don't know, that's like the relationship of people going up north for their recreation, for their play. That's just, to me, a very, it's just so much a part of what I think of my life growing up and what it was, what it was to be a Michigander.
Sure.
And so my characters have this, city and country experience. And I mean, maybe other people in other states have that experience too, but to me that felt very Michigan. And the way that that up north is this kind of magical place, that's just beautiful, and lakes and water and nature. When we were driving, we actually we had to get off the highway because there was traffic, and we accidentally we're driving through Kalkaska County, which is where my grandparents used to live. And there's a road, Fletcher Road turns into Sharon Road. And then Sharon Road turns into Shively Road. Shively is my maiden name.
Okay.
And so we stopped there and took pictures. So that is like that. And my husband said, you know, this is like, where are we? And I said, we're at my childhood. This is my heart. So yeah, and also my characters, they have a relationship with hunting, and you know, that I associate with going up north and the hunting that my grandfather and uncles and father did. And the hunting is actually kind of a mythic thing, which I always felt it was too. So yeah, to me, it's all the things that they go to Ann Arbor, they go to University of Michigan. So Ann Arbor also, if you grow up in Detroit, has, I don't know, to me it was kind of like a foreign country, even though it was only 45 minutes away. So I have them go to the campus. Their high school teacher takes them on a tour. My high school teacher took me on a tour to, and it was like just this amazing place. So I gave them all my Michigan experiences. I don't know. I don't feel like I could write this book and just set it somewhere else.
Well, then let me ask you this, because I'm also interested. Had you written a mystery before this?
So I'm not sure I would call this a mystery per se. I mean, it has elements of a mystery in it.
Okay.
Yeah. But no, I hadn't.
And
I mean, my memoir is kind of a mystery too, in that there's a death, and my character, I guess it was me, tries to find out, you know, how did this person die?
And I mean, were there things you needed to learn as a writer to make these work, you know, to make that engine go, as it were, you know, when you talk, I mean, like.
Yes, there's a lot to learn. So I have this stack of books. Here's a book that I highly recommend to any writer. It's a craft book, so it's a book of essays about writing fiction. It's by Benjamin Percy, who is actually my MFA advisor, and it's called Thrill Me, Essays on Fiction. And it has titles like urgency, suspense, and you know, he's telling people who are not genre writers, you know, they're not writing thrillers or horror or mysteries per se, but he's saying you should still use those elements that make those kind of books page turners in your fiction, even if you're thinking it's a general audience novel and not a genre novel. And so I've learned a lot from him, from studying with him in my MFA, and from that book, which I share with my students, about how really, no matter what you're calling the category of your book, it should have these elements of that mysteries have, that thrillers have, that you know, even fantasy have, the things that are you know, that get the readers to turn the pages.
I know
nobody, if you want to just have a bunch of pretty sentences, you should write poetry.
I know you agree with that. I'm just wondering, I mean, I have to imagine there are writers out there who might disagree with him. Am I correct on that? Using those tricks?
Yes, there are. And certainly even I would say, I mean, he talks about this in Thrill Me, that when he was getting his MFA, that the professor said, you can't submit anything that has any genre elements. And so he's giving some pushback towards that for sure.
Very nice, very nice. So the process of writing this book, I mean, how long did it take you? What did you have to do to write half? I mean, what?
I had to get up at 4 a.m. and work for 25 hours a day.
I mean, you're teaching, you're parenting. I mean, like, how long did this take? And you know, from idea to you know, being published, how long did this whole process take to write the book out?
Yeah, it took a lot longer than I expected. So the story that grew into the book was published in 2013, I think. Yeah. And then between then and then the book came out in 2020. Between that time, my memoir came out in 2017. But I did multiple drafts of the book, and some of the drafts are really quite different from each other. And I had an agent who, when I gave her the first draft, she said, "Oh yeah, this is a really unusual book. The first person plural voice is not something that's used very much in fiction. But I had another manuscript, like it's kind of, also unusual in this, and I sold it it did pretty well after, like, I don't know, 5 to 7 drafts. And like, I read this email and thought, she's insane. No way am I doing 5 to 7 drafts. But I didn't say that back. I just quietly thought it to myself.
Okay.
And yeah, of course, the end of the story is it did take multiple drafts. My agent was right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very nice. So why do you think somebody should read half? What do you think would be a reason why, somebody out here in the internet, if you will, why should they pick up this book?
Well, I've been told, as I said, that it's a page turner. And I don't know about you, but I really like books that I can read fast. Like, to me, that's, like sign me up. Not
Yes.
that I won't read a long book, but yeah, my husband just finished War and Peace, like during the pandemic, and I just let him like tell me about it, like just summarize it for me. No, I'm sounding less serious than I really am. I actually do love reading serious books. But my book, I've been told you can read it in 2 sittings. And I think that's because it does have, it does have a lot of suspense, and it does have this sense of wanting to find out what's going to happen. But I've also been told, and I hope this is true, that it is lyrical and poetic, and has a distilled quality that is really quite unusual, and that's beautiful.
Sure.
So I would say that that it can be appreciated, both on the sentence level, but also just on the level of like a good yarn, like a story that you want to find out what's going to happen. And also, my hope was that I knew I was writing something unusual. Like I said, my agent said, you're doing that? And that thrilled me. I was like so excited. Like when I worked with a writer at a conference who I really respect, and he read part of the manuscript, and he said, "I have actually never seen anybody try to do this before." Like another writer would think, "Oh, then maybe I shouldn't do it." But instead I was like, yes, I love that. So I'm excited about that, but I also really love when people read it and they say that it was an easy read, because I'm doing something very technically difficult, and it was a challenge to write it, but I don't want it to be a challenge to read it.
So to get, that fascinates me. So to get it to be that page turner, I mean, in all those edits that you had to do, your agent was right.
Yeah, my agent was right.
What did you have to take out? What had to be, what had to be stored away maybe for another time? Like what, or maybe not another time?
Yeah. So I think when I began it, as I said, I was influenced by the movie Boyhood, in which it's a coming of age, and really that's all it's trying to be. Is I'm going to show you a 6-year-old turning into an 18-year-old
Right.
in real time. And so my first draft was just that, and each like age was kind of what happened was self-contained, almost like its own story. So it was more actually like linked short stories than it was like a novel in which you have a through line of something, a question that you open up with that will get answered only by the end. So I really had to, I had to take out the parts that didn't contribute to the forward momentum. And I had to make sure that every part, like everything that happens causes the next thing to happen, causes the next thing to happen, causes the next thing to happen.
Okay. So what's coming next?
Well, I have a book that's based on a year that I spent in Paris.
Okay.
And once again, I'm stealing from my daughter's life. My character is an American who is plunged into a French immersion program, not speaking any French, and then all of a sudden she's at school and her teacher won't speak anything but French, and so she's a fish out of water. And there's she's kind of sarcastic and funny, but there's some real, conflict and sad things that happen too. But it's a departure from my 2 other books in that, well, okay, spoiler, it has a happy ending, like a really happy ending, which is fun to do.
Fantastic. So when can we expect to see it?
Oh,
no pressure.
No time soon.
Okay.
I mean, even between, usually between, when a book is finished and my agent says it's ready to go, then it's like, can be even 2 years after that before it actually comes out.
Okay. All right. Well, Sharon, thank you so much. And let me say about your book, Half, this was one that hadn't readily jumped out, and there were a few committee members who were just adamant. And when people started reading it, I mean, they loved it. First of all, being from Wisconsin, I mean, Wisconsin University Press is not one that always jumps out at us. It's usually in Michigan notable books, more Michigan State or Wayne or U of M. But I have to say, very happy that those committee members, I mean, they made the case, and they said, you guys got to read this book, and we all did, and we really loved it, and we voted.
Oh.
So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Great book. No, and again, it sometimes has to do with the press. Sometimes it just has to do, that we hadn't heard about it, and there were a few very dedicated committee members who were like, we all need to read this book, and we did, and it was a very welcome book in addition to the list for this 2021 year. So thank you very much, and thank you for spending the time with us today.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Oh, no problem. And to all of you, thank you for viewing. And again, this is Sharon Harrigan with her book, Half by University of Wisconsin Press. Sharon, thank you so much, and have a great day, and hope to see more work from you in the near future.
You too. Thank you so much, Tim.
Yeah, no problem.